In the previous lesson, we learned about some of the following things. We learned about how the economic policy of boycotting British goods, which hurt the British economy, led to Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. But Parliament still wanted to recoup the losses from the French Indian War, so they passed another tax, which was an indirect tax, unlike the Stamp Act, which was direct, which placed an import tax on paint, paper, tea, and other things. The colonists boycotted, and like the Stamp Act before, Parliament's forced to repeal this, all except for the tax on tea. However, the fact that the tax was left on tea would be instrumental in one of the most famous things in history, the Boston Tea Party. The tax being left on tea would cause the colonists to have to send a message when the price on tea was actually lowered because of the Tea Act. The Tea Act, which was not a tax, was passed to give the British East India Company exclusive rights to sell tea in the colonies. This lowered the price of tea, and the Sons of Liberty feared that the colonists would break the boycott and buy the cheaper tea. Well, to send a message to the colonists to stick together and not break the boycott on tea, even though tea is cheaper, the Sons of Liberty organized the Boston Tea Party, which destroys millions of dollars in British tea. The Boston Tea Party would have dire consequences, though, for the colonists when the British pass what's known as the Intolerable Acts in response to the Tea Party in Boston, and also the smaller tea parties in Georgetown and Charlestown. And the Intolerable Acts had several sub-clauses to them, which included closing of Boston Port, and perhaps one of the most harsh, the Quartering Act, which was where people had to provide food and shelter for British soldiers. So our lesson picks up today with the colonists' response to the Intolerable Acts. And the colonists pretty much felt like the following. They're all crying because the Intolerable Acts were horrible. So they decide to have a meeting to discuss them. And what they have is what's known as the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress would be a national meeting of representatives from all over the colonies, which were sent to Philadelphia to discuss what could be done about the Intolerable Acts. So all of the colonies were going to send representatives to the Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress. And, of course, the meeting of who to send to the First Continental Congress occurred in South Carolina's capital city, earliest successful settlement, and site of the elite in South Carolina, which would be what city? Yes, Charlestown. in Charlestown, where, once again, is known as the Low Country, where the elite planters were, was where the meeting took place. And in South Carolina, in Charlestown, the meeting that took place was to decide who they're going to send to the First Continental Congress. Who are we going to send to the First Continental Congress, which of course was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. At this meeting in Charlestown, it was decided that the people that were sent were, of course, mostly the elite planters. Now, at this meeting also, they kicked out the royal governor of the Carolinas. Well, they didn't kick them out, but they created a committee to govern Carolina, known as the General Committee of 99. So they elected or appointed 99 people from different parts or social standings in the Carolinas to govern South Carolina. They picked 99 people so there wouldn't be a tie. These 99 people, once again, comprised of 69 planters, 15 artisans, and 15 other common people. But once again, you can see the disproportionate representation of the elite planters in the General Committee of 99. So the South Carolina representatives travel to Philadelphia to the First Continental Congress, where they're discussing, what are we going to do about the Intolerable Acts? This is awful. I have people living in my homes. The Boston economy is going downhill because the ports shut down. Said, well, what shall we do? Some people are like, we need war with Britain. But they're like, wait, Britain has the most powerful army in the world. Perhaps we should try to avoid war. Like, yes, perhaps it would be wise to use economics. So, said, we'll boycott. Said, we will do more than boycott. We will just cut down, shut off trade completely with Britain. And what we will establish is known as a what are things that come into the country called? Yes, imports. Non-importation. What are things that go out called? Yes, exports. Non-exportation agreement. So at the First Continental Congress, they agreed to stop trade with Britain completely until they repeal the Intolerable Acts. Now, South Carolina, though, were like, whoa, wait. We can't quit all trade with Britain because our economy will completely crumble. They're like, hey, can't we trade Carolina gold with them? Because otherwise our whole economy is going to go down the tubes. Like, yes, go ahead, South Carolina. Can we trade rice? Because it's essential to the survival of our colony. And it was agreed that South Carolina could still trade rice. So, with the exception of rice, all trade with Britain was shut down when the First Continental Congress decided upon a non-importation, non-exportation agreement with Great Britain in response to Great Britain passing the Intolerable Acts. Now, South Carolina's leadership at the First Continental Congress cannot be overexpressed because the president of the First Continental Congress was actually from South Carolina. And this gentleman, of course, was a wealthy planter from South Carolina. His name was Henry Middleton. And Henry Middleton, who we are over here creating a pretty poor drawing of him, was from South Carolina, and he would be the president of the First Continental Congress. Of course, he had his hair in rollers like was the style back then, and this is probably not a very good drawing of him, but it will get our point across. So you need to be impressed, because your state, when it was a colony of Britain, was really important at the First Continental Congress, because the president of the First Continental Congress was named Henry Middleton, and he was from South Carolina. So, the most important meeting in early South Carolina was led by, or the most important meeting in the early United States was led by Henry Middleton, who was from South Carolina. So of all the people in the colonies they could pick to lead this meeting as the president, they picked a South Carolinian named Henry Middleton to lead the First Continental Congress, where the 13 colonies sent delegates to discuss which acts, which were punishment for the tea parties that took place in Boston, Georgetown, South Carolina, and Charlestown. Yes, the Intolerable Acts. So, let's see a real picture of Mr. Middleton and see how bad our drawing is of him and what he really looks like. Well, first of all, let's review the First Continental Congress. This is a much better picture than the one we can't see on my notes, but colonists met to discuss the problems of the Intolerable Acts. South Carolina representatives met in Charlestown to elect people to attend the First Continental Congress and to establish the General Committee of 99 to govern the colony instead of the royal governor. Here's Mr. Middleton, a much better picture of him than what we created, which is totally my fault. So, Henry Middleton from South Carolina was the president of the First Continental Congress, the leader of the First Continental Congress. At the First Continental Congress, it was decided that trade with Britain should be cut off by establishing a non-importation, non-exportation agreement. But South Carolina, realizing that if all trade is shut off, begged for rights to still be traded, and they were granted this request. Now, before we get into the next part of the lesson, let's review some of the acts that were passed and the whole reason that Britain was trying to collect taxes in the first place. What was the reason that Britain was trying to collect taxes in the first place? Yes, it was from debt that was acquired during the French Indian War. During the French Indian War, Britain tried to recoup some of this, which, during the French Indian War, they passed an act to stop smuggling and illegal trade with France, called the Sugar Act. So this was actually during the French Indian War. But after the French Indian War, Britain tried to pass on this debt to the colonists with even more ferocity. And what was the first act that was passed? Yes, it was the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, being a direct tax, which really upset the colonists, was repealed, and Britain tried an indirect tax, which the colonists hopefully would not be as opposed to. What was the name of this tax? It starts with a T. Yes, it was called the Townshend duties. So, now the Townshend duties, like the Stamp Act, were repealed, but they left the tax on one item from the Townshend duties, which would have dire consequences because of the next action of Parliament, which was not a tax, and it was designed to help the failing British East India Company. Yes, it's called the Tea Act. The Tea Act was then passed. Now, the Tea Act, which wasn't a tax, would precede the efforts of the colonists to ensure that the boycott on tea was not broken. And what was passed was called the Boston Tea Party. Now, what follows the Boston Tea Party were punishing acts by the British, which closed Boston Harbor, put people in the homes of the colonists, and other punishing things the British forced upon the colonists. What were the name of these acts? Yes, they're called the Intolerable Acts. Following the Intolerable Acts, the colonists seek to meet in what's called the First Continental Congress. And this was to avoid war with Britain by using economics, a non-importation, non-exportation agreement. However, while the colonists were actually meeting, traveling to or from the First Continental Congress, the first shots of the revolution would break out. The first shots of the revolution would break out near Boston, Massachusetts, two smaller towns, which were called Lexington and Concord. Well, even though the colonists had been trying to avoid violent war with the British, it was too late when the Battle of Lexington and Concord broke out, and they realized that they need to meet and plan for war with Britain. The next meeting that occurred after the Battle of Lexington and Concord was the Second Continental Congress. It is at the Second Continental Congress where the Declaration of Independence is drafted and signed, and war with Britain was inevitable. The Revolutionary War would begin. So the first battle of the Revolutionary War, the war with Great Britain, would be the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Lexington and Concord is where the famous saying of the shot heard round the world occurred, because it really wasn't a planned battle. In fact, the British had a heavy troop presence because they were trying to either resupply the forts near the towns of Lexington and Concord, or retrieve the guns from them. I forget which at the moment. But what happens is one shot breaks out between a highly tense situation of a colonial militia and British Army troops. No one knows who shot the first shot, but it's known as the shot heard round the world. This battle would lead to the Second Continental Congress, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. There's a picture of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There's another. This was the first battle of the Revolutionary War. And it was between two towns, which you can see on this map. It began, I may be wrong, in Lexington, I believe, and all along the way, the colonials were firing upon this group of British troops from the woods. The British had to retreat to Boston, and they suffered pretty heavy losses from the colonials. Well, in the next lesson, we're going to learn more about the Declaration of Independence, which was signed by 4 South Carolinians, and the overall purpose of the Declaration of Independence, and some other information about it. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.